My name's Ed Bicknell. I'm from London, England, and for far too long, at least until I knew better, I was in the agency profession, and then I was in the management profession, and then I got back into the agency profession. And the acts I represented were, amongst others, Jerry Rafferty, Dire Straits, Mark Knopfler's solo career, the Blue Nile, and an artist called Paul Brady, who was a very successful songwriter. I don't think they've changed as much as everybody thinks they've changed. The mechanics have changed a bit, and the technology has definitely changed. But essentially what you're trying to do is take an act that you hopefully believe in, because if you don't believe in the act, it's not going to work. And you're going to take that art, if you like, and you're going to turn it into commerce for presumably the largest audience you can get. But having said that, you know, the objectives of different acts and different managers vary. You might have an act whose sole ambition is to play to 300 people in a folk club, and that's the pinnacle of their expectation. And then you might have an act who wants to sell, you know, millions of downloads or whatever, and end up playing in a football stadium. So it depends. I mean, you need to define at the outset with the act and the kind of act that they are, and the people themselves, what their objective is. So, and you've got a lot of tools now that you didn't have, social networking being the obvious one. So you can get out to more people, but of course the people have to know you're there in the first place. I've done a lot of teaching to students who say, you know, they used to say, oh, I can make a record in my bedroom now and it doesn't cost anything, I can put it on the web. Great, but who's going to go there? Their parents, you know, and they don't want to pay anything. So you've got to somehow, you have to promote yourself and start establishing a name. Now, in modern parlance, when I was at William Morris, the buzzword was branding. Everything's a brand. That's just a different way of expressing the same thing. You're trying to build a name, you're trying to build a fan base, you're trying to build a fan base that will be loyal and will stick with you and may travel. You're trying to you know, get your music onto every available outlet, which is all the outlets we know about, radio, television, and so on. It's great having a clip on YouTube, but if nobody's watching it, so what? And then, but somehow there's this sort of, it's almost like a chemical process where somebody puts something up and it has a kind of boomerang effect. Suddenly you can look on it 2 weeks later and it's had 1 million hits. One of the things that absolutely astonished me when I looked at it was the number of hits that artists in the dance field get. Millions more than mainstream rock acts and so on. And I was absolutely stunned by that. Armand Van Helden or somebody like that's getting 8-9 million hits on a YouTube video. And there's sort of, you know, Radiohead crawling along at the back, and they've had 6 hits, and that was all the singer. He likes looking at himself. So, you know, this, I'm being flippant, but the tools to do it now there are many more, but it doesn't make it easier because there is far more competition than there used to be. Far more. I mean, it's amazing to me to come here to Estonia, and you've got God knows how many bands playing here over these 3 days. I was absolutely stunned by it. There seem to be more bands than population. It's the nature of large multinational corporations in every area of endeavour to be slow off the mark. The way that they're set up doesn't allow for things to happen quickly. It just doesn't. And the bigger the company, the more to get anything done in a corporation, you have to go through layers and layers of people. When I was running my own business, I would make decisions often involving very large sums of money or large numbers of people within a second. It was almost an instinctive thing. When you've been doing it long enough, you don't even have to sit around and analyze it. You just go yes or no. When you're in a corporation, you've got these layer and layer and layer until you get up to the person who's basically going to sign the check. So the nature of the process is by definition much slower. I think that the record industry caught a huge cold back in the 80s by being very slow to pick up on compact disc. We happened to be signed, by which I mean Dire Straits happened to be signed to Polygram. Polygram was owned by Philips, and Philips invented it. And we were able, more by accident in the design, to sort of hop onto that very early on, 1982, I think. But the industry as a overall, what drives the music industry is fear. That's the main driver. Fear that they're not going to get the next big act. Fear that they're going to get fired. Because everybody who works in the music industry now who's not self-employed will be fired. Not for necessarily doing anything wrong or not being successful, simply because you get to the age of 45, or let me be incredibly sexist and say you're a woman and you get to the age of 35, which is a ludicrous way of running a business, but it happens constantly. And what the corporations have always been good at is tapping into what I'll call the independent people, the people at street level, if you like. And you have a few figures through the history of pop music who've become very successful sort of tycoons almost, but they still retain their street sense. Chris Blackwell, who started Island Records, is somebody I'm thinking of. And who I interviewed a couple of years ago, and believe me, he's absolutely on it still. But there is an issue that you're talking about, yeah. The big record companies, the investment things got what the big record companies have become more and more and more like in my time in working in it is their short-termism is much more obvious. And this has been said a million times, but back in the 60s, 70s, an act would generally get a shot at making 3 albums, possibly 4, before they'd get dumped. Now they get 1, and then they get dumped. That doesn't mean their career's over, but they'll probably get dropped if they don't get an immediate success. And the other thing that happens in all of the big companies is the turnover of staff. When I was working with the Straits, we got through 17 managing directors in 25 years at Phonogram UK. It was just a revolving door coming round. So I never took any notice of them. I used to do what I did, go in with my plan, go to the worker bees who were going to do it, and off we'd go. And I would ignore the senior management pretty much. And if any of them were giving me a hard time, I'd say, well, it doesn't matter. I'll just wait until you get fired, and then I'll speak to the next guy. Which, of course, pissed them off. But then the door came zooming round again, and out they would go. 17 managing directors in 25 years is a very inefficient way of running your business. In America, we were with Warner Brothers, thank God. And for the majority of the time, the head of the company was Mo Austin, who was this old-time record guy who was brilliant. And I had a totally different relationship with them. With Polygram, I told them what I was doing, what we were doing, and with Warner Brothers, we discussed it. That was the difference. I think that the position that the records companies have taken about the reduction in their income through illegal downloading has to some extent been self-serving. The record companies still sell millions and millions of bona fide CDs all over the world. The figures are actually not that much lower. They are lower, but they're not that much lower. It's not like they suddenly went from 1 billion to 100,000 overnight. It is coming down, and downloading is going up, and that's legal downloading and illegal downloading. So I think a lot of the stuff that came out of record companies was actually, and this is just my personal view, and I'm sure that many people will disagree with this, was in some ways a bit of a front to cover making extra profit by not investing at the bottom end, if you see what I mean. They kind of exaggerated the problem. I'm not saying it's not a problem, but I'm simply saying that it kind of got a bit exaggerated. I think if the product of your endeavors is people's talent, and you don't invest in young talent, then that's a very, very, very short-sighted way of running your business. And it will have a knock-on effect. And the music industry moves very quickly. It's a very fast process. And there's an issue arising. It hasn't quite got there yet. But within the next 5 to 10 years, a lot of the older acts, the real household names, are going to be retiring or dying or both. Do we really think the Rolling Stones are going to be on tour when they're 80? Probably not. Same with the Eagles, same with Tom Jones, same with all that whole bracket are going to shift aside. And people are constantly going on about what's going to replace it. Well, it will be replaced because that's the nature of art and commerce. And I don't happen to subscribe to the view that music should be seen in stadiums, which is a total hypocrisy on my part because I've put hundreds of shows on in stadiums. But I would not go and see an act in a field. And that's just a consequence of my age and where I'm at this point in my life. But people say, where are the new stadium acts coming from? Well, there are plenty coming up. Muse are a stadium act. Radiohead are a stadium act, if they want to play in stadiums. I mean, I'm not in favour of gigs in stadiums, but the gigs in stadiums happen as a consequence of popularity. You're trapped. Or what are you going to do? You're going to go and play the Blogs Arena for 50 nights? No, bands won't do that. The history of the creative arts, all of the creative arts, is about the creators and the exploiters trying to find what is fair in the middle. Now, it's blatantly obvious that back in the 1950s, the exploiters, and I'm thinking particularly of some of the American record companies there, which were not corporations, they were independent companies, like Atlantic, for instance. What they did to black artists from the perspective of today was appalling. Ray Charles was paid $30 to record What Did I Say, and that's all he was paid, ever. The idea, it's almost gone full circle. The idea back then was you made a record to promote your career and you made your money out on the road. And those acts didn't tour, by which I mean the tours had a beginning and a middle and an end. They worked. I did a tour years and years ago with an old soul act that probably none of you will have heard of, called Archie Bell and the Drells. I was riding into London from Heathrow Airport with Archie. He's sitting in the back. We're chatting. They've just come back from playing American oil bases in the Middle East. In that year, they had done 234 shows and recorded 2 albums. And this was absolutely the norm. And they would often play 2 shows a night. Now we've got a load of wet, lily-livered, lazy musicians who can't get an hour together before they fall over and weep. But coming back to what you're asking me is, when you use a word like, and I have been, in my entire career, fiercely anti-record company. I mean fiercely. Because I always thought the business model that they operated on was essentially a complete rip-off. Interestingly enough, the only people who rip off not only the people who are providing their product, but also their consumers. When CD came in, and the pricing of CD was whatever it was, this was all done under some great illusion that it cost more to make these things. It didn't. It cost less. And that because you got a crappy fucking jewel case, and there's a nice little paper pamphlet in it, which an Alsatian can't read the lyrics, that this was an expensive thing. So that what they did was they artificially got a price rise when their product was actually costing them less than it had done. And it was a brilliant piece of marketing. It was like they'd found North Sea oil. And what they managed to do was they sold the same stuff back to the consumer twice. And they got more money for it the second time, and they had no initiation costs. They didn't have to go and make the record again. Didn't even get the artwork done. They simply squeezed it down and down and down so you couldn't see it. One of the worst things that happened to me was the loss of artwork. I always thought artwork was a great part of the music experience. You know, and memorizing album sleeves, and who played drums on Phil Spector's records, all this kind of stuff, you know, stuff you talk about on the tour bus. Because you've watched the pornography and this is all you're left with. But I think that when you talk about people being ripped off and stolen from, it's so subjective. There are some obvious, like the Ray Charles example I just used. That's obviously not a fair way of treating somebody. And we all know that, of course, there was a racist element to that, because the black acts were definitely treated worse than the white acts, and the white acts were treated appallingly as well. But what we've got to now, I think, and it's partly a consequence of the economic state of the planet generally, is that people are just more aware that the record company has a high overhead and that the band has it's more, everybody's a bit more in the middle, if you know what I mean. For instance, the idea that somebody would come along and do a publishing deal with a songwriter, whereby the publisher ended up owning the copyrights forever, is now just about over. It happens in Nashville occasionally, but pretty much everywhere else, a publisher administers the copyright for a period of years, and then the ownership reverts back to the writer. So the writer owns the song that the writer wrote, which is absolutely how it should be. And that's changed, because back in the day, people got a 50-50 deal. They didn't own the copyright, and there were all sorts of scams of sub-publishers that didn't really exist in the middle, taking more bits off. And things were set up to rip people off. I think now it's more, because it's corporate, and because these are mostly public companies, they're subject to a whole load of different accounting and auditing rules than some of the independents used to be. The independents, on the other hand, were people who would take a risk, often a big risk. And as I was saying a few minutes ago, I mean, they would generally stick with it. A&M Records, Island Records, Chrysalis Records, Charisma Records, and so on, Capricorn Records. They would stick with an act through 3 or 4 albums. And by the time they got to album number 4, if they hadn't recouped, they were probably in a bit of a pile of poo-poo by then.